today's topic is how to defend good ideas from bad arguments. And I want us to start with the reason why this was created. And it wasn't created just for the clickbait title, even though it is quite a clickbait title. But I think pretty much everyone must have faced the following situation. A situation where you have some idea, some proposal, something that you want to be changed, and you go to your office, you go to whoever makes a decision, you have your pitch, you thought about it, you know it's a great idea, you're certain, you have all the right arguments for it, and then once you're done, you encounter a baffling response. You start hearing comments that are irrational, that are absurd, that are surprising, and you don't know what to do. You don't exactly know how to respond because it kind of catches you off guard. And then it turns out that a comment that you were certain is really silly and dumb, all of a sudden turns the discussion away from what you wanted, or turns it into such a conception that your original idea was bad, and somehow it gets passed over. And it becomes this very frustrating situation in which we did everything right, and yet someone just derailed the entire conversation. And I know that this has happened to me in the past before I did debating, but it certainly happens a lot to my clients. And I have the right tools for you today. And that's because debaters are pretty much accustomed to this situation, and we're very good at thinking on our feet and on knowing what to do. And the good thing is that it's really not a talent, it's a skill. And that's what we're going to do today in this talk. So I'm going to help you by the end of these 90 minutes to recognize these rhetorical traps. And here I'm going to refer specifically to these kind of claims that might be absurd or irrational. I think there could be an entire different talk on claims that are actually valid, but this is not today's focus. Then we're going to learn how to respond and how to do so in such a way that leaves us also pretty much in our zone, but also that doesn't create hostility towards us, and ultimately to steer back any chaotic discussion back into what it should be. So, how does this talk going to look like? This is going to be quite an interactive talk, so in that sense, you are going to do some work as well. You don't have to, but with a raise of hand, feel free to participate. Also, if you have questions during this workshop, feel free to ask. For me, this is a very good opportunity to really help you with your communication needs. So I see this not as just me talking. So we're going to cover 6 of the most common attacks. It's actually a bit more than 6. I grouped some of them together, which is a bit of cheating, but I think 6 is a nice number. Also, I'm very tempted to do the clickbaity thing of saying 5 is my favorite, and that way you will stay tuned. But all of them are actually very relevant. And then after we will understand each and what makes it so dangerous, we're going to talk about what are the best responses. We're going to practice this a bit, and we will end with some general tips and Q&A. So that's the plan, and now diving into the first kind of attack. So the first kind of attack is something that people encounter a lot of times. They don't know this name. This is a kind of debatey term for it, but it refers to a situation in which someone brings a comment, an idea, a question that are simply irrelevant to what we are talking about or to the discussion as was defined. So it just goes beyond the limits of this discussion. And the thing is that the moment you become aware of this, it's really easy to detect, but it's a conversation killer. Because usually the way it goes is that we have a conversation and then someone throws something completely different, and then the conversation goes to talk about that, and people start forgetting the original topic, and then it kind of goes from there, and it's really, really hard to get things back on track. So beyond recognizing that, I want us to also see what this means, because there are a few common types of comments that could be off-clash. So the first kind has to do with someone saying something that is just definitionally wrong. So let's say that we have a proposition that talks about plea bargains, and then someone says, oh, but this would really make any kind of divorce negotiation tough. Now, this is off-clash. Why? So discussion is about plea bargains, and someone says, oh, divorce discussions. Okay, so I'll get us warmed up. So it's off-clash because plea bargains are within the criminal law, and divorce is not. So it's just not related to it. And this person probably didn't know, but then it means that the comment, while it might be a concern that this person has, it's just detached from the actual topic that we're talking about. Or it might be that I'm suggesting that we need to have some sort of reform in the system, and I want the reform to start next year, and then someone says, oh, but this spring, it's such a difficult time to start. Here, this person just wasn't paying attention to what we were saying. So if the proposal was to start this spring, he would have been right. But currently, this just has nothing to do with the way we defined our proposal, and sometimes people just don't listen and then they end up talking about something else. So that's the first kind. The second kind is just someone bringing in a different topic. So let's say that we're having a marketing meeting and I want to discuss our marketing plan for product A. And then someone says, but what about product B? Product B really needs our attention. They might be right, but we're here to talk about product A, and this is irrelevant. So this is just something else that this person is bringing, and then it derails us from the ability to talk about product A. The third type of off-clash is someone challenging an underlying assumption. So usually when we have some sort of discussion, we have a theme for it or we have an agenda for it. And this includes oftentimes certain assumptions about what this discussion is going to be about that are not necessarily written. But let's say that we are now talking about the best way to implement a new product. This means that we already know that we are going to use the new product, and the discussion is about the ways of implementation. But then if someone says, but maybe we need to adopt another product, this goes against the assumption that we have, that we are now past the stage of deciding whether to use the product or not. We are already at a much later point in the discussion. And what this person is actually doing is taking us back a step, because it doesn't respect the fact that we already had certain agreements and certain things that we are basing our discussion on. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes it is not important for someone to raise different question marks about what we're doing, but oftentimes it's just a disruption. It's just something that brings frustration, that takes us back. Oftentimes it's the people that miss the deadline for the discussion or that they remember late, and then it becomes simply off-clash. Then fourth kind of off-clash is someone that rushes ahead, that basically pulls the cart before the horses. And then they might even do it for a good reason. They might be very passionate or enthusiastic, but they start steering the discussion towards a question that we cannot determine before logically we settle different questions. So let's say we are talking about our system and we're trying to think about the strategy really and how we want the system to work. Now, a person might say, oh, look, but we need to start thinking about how we would do that exactly and about our service and how we would deal with all the data. And this might be important, but if we're at the point of deciding a strategy, these questions are too technical. We can't really answer them before we have decided on a path to take. And in that sense, it might even cause the impression that maybe our idea is half-baked, or that maybe this can't be implemented because this person is already rushing ahead towards something that we cannot answer. And then it becomes off-clash simply because we are not at the point of discussing this. So this cannot be the topic that we are talking about. So then, once we know what off-clash is, how do we respond? What do we do? So the first thing is don't engage with the content directly. I think this is the number one mistake that people can do. They start answering the content of the comment, and then it becomes about that comment. And then that person replies, and then someone else says something about it, and then we can see how we drift towards talking about that. So if you recognize that something is off-clash, it doesn't matter whether it is true or false, it doesn't matter whether it's accurate, it doesn't matter if it's good or bad, don't engage with it directly. What you do want to do is you want to state that it's off-clash. Now, you don't have to use the term because we're not debaters, but you want to explain that this is not the topic at hand. These are not the questions that we are here to discuss at the moment, and you can give a short rationale. So if it has to do with the definition, you can explain, oh, this doesn't stem from the proposal as we defined it. Oh, this is not what we're here to discuss. So you can shortly explain why it's off-clash, but you need to say that this is not what we're talking about. Here, you can add to that some sort of validation. So it doesn't mean that you have to be rude about saying that something is off-clash. Oftentimes, someone would say something off-clash because they really care. They have a lot of emotions about it. They don't even think about whether it's relevant or not. So what you can do in this case is you can give that person the credit of saying, I think this is really important. However, we are here to discuss this and this and this. Or, I think it's a great idea and it merits its own meeting. And we will address this, but not during this meeting. And then you are showing them that it's not about them being wrong or what they say is not important. You are acknowledging what they said, and yet you are not falling into the trap of starting to answer what they just brought up. And I think it's also important, especially if they're adamant about it. So you can even say, no, we are going to talk about this. You can show that you're very serious, but don't let it derail you from what you're talking about. And then what you want is to pivot back to the topic. So here I think it would help really redefining again what we're talking about, and then just making sure that we are back on track, just giving someone else the ability to speak, or you yourself continuing the topic as it was. And I would say that it's not rude to do so. Oftentimes, you would be even helping other people, because I think with off-clash, many times it's a whim of the certain person that said this thing, but everyone else sitting in that meeting, in that pitch, they want to talk about the topic. They don't want to go into that other off-clash comment. So by you steering this back, you are doing everyone a favor. So you might be adamant yourself, but ultimately everyone would commend you for doing that. So in that sense, I think this is something that can help you a lot. Now, to make sure that we could do that successfully, I have a little drill for us. So I have here a list of off-clash arguments about different topics, and I would like you to try and explain why these are off-clash, or why I claim that these are off-clash. And if you want, you can add what you would say to that. So the first topic at hand is, let's say we are meeting at some school, and I am a grandmaster in chess, and we're talking about setting up an extracurriculum chess club in that school. And then one of the teachers in the meeting says, but what about the children who are not analytical? Why is this off-clash?
Because they will not be interested in chess, right?
Yes, the chess club is probably not for them. It's an extracurriculum. Kids can choose whether they join the club or not. And if they are not analytical and they don't like it, they don't have to go. So in that sense, they are not being catered to. And then we might want to offer them other activities, but in this meeting with myself, the Grand Chess Master at the moment, this is irrelevant to the question of whether I'm going to start this club at the moment. So then this is not something that would help us, and we would steer the discussion back to, yeah, these kids don't have to join the club. The question is, should we have this club for those who do want it? Do we see benefits for it? And then we continue. Second example, let's say we have an academic conference that has the title, How Should the International Community Respond to the Damage Caused by Vladimir Putin? And someone comes to the conference and says, I think Putin is not that bad. Why is that off clash?
Because they're undermining what your concerns are, and then they are just stating an opinion.
Yes, very correct. This conference already assumes there are damages done by Putin. Yes, and then wants to discuss what should be the international response. When this person says, I think Putin is not that bad, he's not willing to comply with this agreement within the conference, and they're just taking us a step back. And even though it might be very tempting to try and convince them and say, no, he's pretty bad, we wouldn't gain anything from this. Also, I would suspect that this person might also be a troll, so it would be not the best idea to feed them. So then what we want to do is we want to steer this back into, okay, these are the questions that we want, and if you want to participate, that's great, but we're not discussing the question of Putin good or bad. Then, third example. Let's say we're having a debate on whether we should ban lobbying activities. And someone says, we should ban bribes to politicians.
Another topic.
So it's another topic, but I would say something even stronger than that. Are bribes legal in the Netherlands? No. It's already against the law to bribe politicians. So this is not what we're here to talk about. Now, we are here to talk about the practice of lobbying. Maybe that person could have said, I think lobbying is a type of bribery, but that would be an argument that is valid, and then that person would have to prove this claim. But saying we need to ban bribes is off clash, because of course we do. We already banned them. This has nothing to do at this point, as it was phrased, to the issue of lobbying. Therefore, we don't even need to engage with this claim. We just say, this is already illegal. The question is about the activity of lobbying and what we think about that, and then we go to discuss that. Then a real-life example. So we did a show debate for an academic conference about an historical topic. And the idea of the organizers was that we would do the show debate, and this would allow people to think about different topics. And then we had Q&A that was supposed to be about what we debated. But then the question that we got from an audience member was, why aren't the speakers more diverse? So just to show you that people can be very, very off clash in reality. I'm not making this up. And here it might have been a real concern, but this is not what we were there to do. So what we had to do is very politely say that we are willing to have this conversation if you want after we're done, and this could be a very fascinating topic to discuss diversity in the world of debate. However, we are here to talk about this historical issue, and we would welcome questions on that. And then we just moved on to other questions without engaging in that, although that person really wanted to, but we couldn't indulge them. Then, fifth example, let's say that at our organization, we're talking about whether we want to run a pilot for some sort of proposal that we have in a certain department. And then someone says, well, full-blown implementation will be hard.
That's why you're doing a pilot.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So both answers are correct. we are not implementing this fully. We are only doing a pilot, and then after the pilot, we would be able to assess, and we would be able to answer the question about full implementation. But talking about full implementation is irrelevant at this stage because we just need to decide whether we want to do a pilot and check it out or not. So this comment is off Clash, and then there is no point of us trying to show, no, it will be easy, it won't be easy. It doesn't matter at this point. All we have to do is get the yes for the pilot.
So, but that will be an explanation why you don't want to continue with that pilot, right?
So
like if you know,
it could have been, but it's not in the way that it is presented. So here, I think what you can do, if you think that this could be a potential objection and you want to make sure that it doesn't turn into one, so you can say that, just explain why this is off Clash, but also say, but if I understand correctly and you are concerned that we might have issues in the future, I think we could only answer that question later on. Or I don't think that this would be very difficult, but we can decide on that after we run the pilot. And then we're even taking the step further. But I think the important thing is not necessarily to assume that this was the intention, sometimes it's not, and to show it as an even if, and if this is what you're referring to, and to, I'd say, not panic about this being an attack on us, because currently it's not. Currently it's just something that is close. Okay, then second type of attack. So here, this is a very important framework for any argument that you're going to have from now on. And this is something that debaters learn from a very early stage, and I think would definitely make you better at persuading. And the concept is that when we try to persuade of something, we always want to be comparative. So we never debate in a vacuum. And what do I mean by that? So the first thing is that whenever we propose something, it is future looking. And this means that in order to try and assess whether it's good or bad, we need to try and explain why we think that this thing is going to be better than the current situation that we have. So this is the first level in which we have to be comparative. We have to compare, if we want to say, for example, that this proposal is effective, we need to compare what we have now and then what kind of result we are expecting in the future. So it's not enough to say we would get good results. We want to show that if we had, let's say, an X amount of patients in the hospital before the treatment, we would have less of them after, and we would want to be comparative, because that's the only way to actually prove that we have done something good, to show that there is a change from what we know currently and what will happen after we implement whatever it is that we want to do. So this is the first level. The second one is that we want to show that whatever we are proposing is going to be better than other scenarios or other alternatives. And this means that if we have two proposals on the table, then it's not enough for me to say, oh, my idea is great. I need to show that my idea is good, but also better than the other proposal. Because if not, I'm not being persuasive enough. The other idea might be selected because it might also be good. The question that is really relevant for us decision makers is which one is better out of the two that we have. And also, we need to take into consideration that sometimes doing nothing is also doing something. So if the alternative is we do nothing or we do the proposal, which is better? Do we prefer to continue as things were, or do we prefer the proposal and whatever it brings? And I think that oftentimes people are not comparative enough, and that's why it's hard for them to persuade, because then it just becomes a list of here are good things, here are bad things. And it's really hard to make a decision just based on whatever flaws or benefits that we can find. So with that being said, a type of attack that often really baffles or turns the discussion into a less productive one is attacks on an idea that are themselves non-comparative. And then they might cause us not to go with an idea that is good just because there could be some sort of flaw with it that is judged in a non-comparative way. So I'm going to divide this into 3 types of sub-attacks, and we're going to see more in detail what this looks like. But it was important for me to get the concept out there. So we're going to talk about a demand for perfection as one type of these attacks. We're going to talk about stating the obvious or truism, and critique in a vacuum. So, first kind of attack, a demand for perfection. And what do I mean by that? It's a kind of attack on an idea that doesn't really question the goodness of it or the efficacy of the idea. All it says is that the idea is not 100%, or that there are certain edge cases that are not dealt with by the idea. So, for example, you are going to do this upgrade in our product, but this will not solve the problem of our legacy users. Notice that this didn't say anything bad about my suggestion. It might be very good for the users to which it is relevant. However, it does not cater to the legacy users. Now, this might be true, but what it might create as an effect is that it might create the impression that my idea is bad because those legacy users are still left with the problem. And the issue is that it doesn't take into consideration that my idea could be excellent and much better than doing nothing, in which the legacy users are not helped, but also no one else is being helped. But then it shows, red flag, some people are not enjoying the benefits that we're offering, and it creates this false impression just because it demands the idea to be perfect. And oftentimes, ideas are not perfect. So sometimes it can be definitionally so. So, for example, if I want to promote a policy in which I am obligating people to take care of their elderly parents, this would not help elderly people who don't have children, right? Just because, okay, it doesn't apply to them, it doesn't mean that I shouldn't do this policy. Obviously, we'll find other solutions for those who don't have anyone to take care of them. But it is not a flaw within itself. Sometimes it's just the way it works. Sometimes there are solutions that are not 100% effective. If it were the case, probably we would have had fantastic laws and no one in jails, so nothing is ever perfect. And yet it doesn't mean that it doesn't solve a problem. So, for example, we might decide that we want to ban some sort of substance, and we could be faced with the claim that there would be a black market. I think there might be a black market for it, just like we see with other substances, but it doesn't mean that all in all, we would not prevent many people from using it, from seeing the harms of it, and yes, there will still be certain victims because they would buy it in the black market. However, comparatively, we've done a lot of good for many people, even though we did not help everyone that we could have had. So here, it's important to note that it doesn't take down the idea as a whole. It just means that it doesn't apply to all cases. Now, then how do we respond if we understand that this is the case? So just as a general point, I don't think you should expect yourself to prove that anything would work 100%. So if you have a pitch or an idea, you don't have to prove that it will be perfect. On the contrary, if you promise that something is going to be perfect, probably people won't believe you, just because I don't think there are perfect solutions out there. I think you want to think in advance if you can. What am I losing? What am I sacrificing? Or maybe what won't I solve, but then constantly have in mind, I need to show that my idea is going to be better than doing nothing or doing something else. And then I might not fully solve the problem, no final solution, but it will still be good enough. And that's what we want to do if we get this kind of attack on us as well. So it's okay to acknowledge the edge cases, but then what you want to do is you want to prove that your change is good enough and that you are doing good in the world. It's going to be better than doing nothing, and then that's what you're aiming for. Then, if possible, it's not always, but if you can do it, I would say that adding to your explanation of why our idea is better, so give some sort of ray of hope. So let's say someone is concerned about the edge cases that are not being met by your proposal. I think you can try and find, if there are, maybe other preventative measures, or maybe there are other ways of dealing with it. So we can say, yes, there might be a black market, but we can enforce better, we can do other things to tackle that. And then you are showing that you have your proposal and there are things to be done outside the scope of your proposal if we are concerned about those cases that are not being met, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive with what we offer. Doesn't always apply, but if it does, why not, right? It shows that you care and it shows that your idea is still good. Then, second type of a non-comparative attack, stating the obvious or truism. And what do I mean by that? I'm referring to a situation in which someone might just say a fact that is a certain cost or something that is a part of our suggestion, but it's not really helpful and it's quite uncontentious. But they say it as if it was a criticism. So, for example, we have this idea and someone says, we'll have to find a budget for it. Yes, we will have to find a budget for it. That's the way it goes. But the way it is said, even though being very truist, makes it sound as if it's a critique, as if it is a bad thing that we would have to find a budget for it. But thing is, it's not. Sometimes it's just neutral. It's not even necessarily bad, or sometimes it's necessary to do that. And it's important to recognize that people do that. Sometimes people just state things that are quite obvious, but are not really a critique of what we are saying. So this is definitely something that can happen. Or let's say we want to send troops to Ukraine, and someone says, but we would be jeopardizing their lives. Yes, in a military, it is the function of people who serve that they risk their lives in order to achieve certain goals. Now, there might be a different question, which is it worth risking their life? But that is a different question, because then the question is, what can we gain from this war? Is it moral to intervene in the war? But the question is, so might be yes or no, but these are the interesting questions. The interesting question is not, would soldiers risk themselves? Of course, but if we think it is for a good cause, we would accept it, and if we think it is for a bad cause, we will not accept it. So then this statement in itself is not something that allows us to actually move the discussion forward. It's just stating something that is a part of the proposition. So here, the important thing to note is that there are always trade-offs. There is always a cost to things, and it's okay that it's that way. And if someone states it, it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing about our proposition. We just need to be honest about it. We need to understand. And the important thing is not to panic the moment we hear that. Yes, there might be prices to pay, and that's okay. And we don't automatically need to treat it as, oh, my idea was attacked. It wasn't necessarily. So then, how do we respond? So don't be alarmed. The first thing, as you saw in the examples that I gave, sometimes yes is a good start, right? Someone says something that is true, you don't automatically need to go into a defensive mode and start saying no and try to say otherwise. Sometimes yes is a great answer. So the person says we would need to find the budget. Yes, we would. And don't say it, of course, in a sarcastic way, but really you can agree with them and you can just show why it's okay that this is the case, which then leads me to the fact that you want to show that it's not necessarily a negative, and if it's even a positive, even better, right? So not in all cases, but sometimes someone would say something that is truest and it's actually good. And then you can even show why it is to your benefit. So let's say you want to replace an old system and someone says, but we won't be able to use the old system at all. Yes, that is a wonderful thing. The old system was slow and buggy, and it's very good that we will not have to use it anymore. So in that sense, great, right? And if applicable, so just like I gave the answer to what you asked earlier, if you do think that there could be some real criticism lying there, or that someone can get a valid critique out of it, or can think a step ahead, you can answer that as well. But then you just want to make sure that you show that this is a separate concern that you are now addressing. So let's say that you are worried about maybe not finding the budget. So it's not a matter of, yes, we have to find a budget, but you're worried that maybe someone in the higher ups would say no to this. Then I think you can say, we will of course have to get a budget for it. If you are concerned that we're not likely to get a green light, I think it is likely because of this and this and this. And then you are separating the real concern from what was said, and you are addressing that. So I think that is fair, but then you want in your head to also make the separation between, okay, what could be a real concern and what is not a real concern, or maybe even a good thing that is going to happen. So then you can use that. Then, third type of non-comparative attack, and this one is the strongest type of attack, which refers to a situation in which someone has a valid criticism. They actually identify a flaw in your proposal, and it might happen. Not all proposals are perfect, as we've seen, and they identify it, but they just throw it out there. It's not comparative. It's just this thing would cause this harm. And the risk with this is that it is both true and it's not ideal, right? There is something wrong with your plan, and yet, in your opinion, and I think it's very true to many cases, the fact that there is a flaw doesn't mean that ultimately we shouldn't go with the idea. The idea might have certain problems that go along with it, and yet it might still be better than doing nothing. Or it might be the best solution we have for this out of everything that was proposed, even though it sucks that this thing is going to happen. And then what you want to do is you want to know that this can happen. In an ideal world, you would have thought about this before doing the pitch, and then you would be aware of it, you would state it explicitly, you would say that this is a cost that we're having, you would already do the comparison at hand. Sometimes you might not think of something and it happens, but then do know that this can be a problem. But what you want to do is you want to bring back the comparison. You want to bring back the comparison either to doing nothing or to the other suggestions, and then your response would look something like this. So here you can choose the best type of response. I'm giving you 3 options, and then based on whatever you're presenting. So option number 1, Sometimes someone points to a flaw or a drawback that exists equally in the other scenarios. So let's say someone says, well, your solution is very costly. It might be that the solution costs a lot, but if we continue the situation as it was, it would also cost us a lot, because here we would deal with maintenance and here we would pay for the new solutions. Ultimately, it boils down to being costly on both sides. And then it just means that while it is true, it is not a consideration for or against, because in all scenarios we would have to pay pretty much the same price. And then this takes it from the table as a way for us to determine which solution is better. So here, if you find that it exists also in the other scenarios, that's one way of solving it. The other way of solving it is that there might be this flaw, but it might be even greater in the alternatives. And then what you want is you want to basically find a common denominator of that flaw. You want to understand what this is, whether it is money, whether it is productivity. So what is this person saying that is going to be harmed? And then you want to show why comparatively we are going to pay much more. So here we might pay a lot right now, but if we do nothing, this and this and this and this will add up and we will pay much more. And then on the metric of money, ultimately, here it's better. So I would think about it like scales. You know, you're putting the two alternatives on the scale and you're seeing, okay, where are we going to pay more, or where we're going to have more of the bad thing that is pointed out that would happen in our proposition. So this is second option. The third option is sometimes we are in a situation in which there is a flaw and comparatively it is worse on that metric. So maybe my solution is just the most expensive out of everything that is being offered. But money might not be the only consideration. Sometimes we might have different priorities. So even though on the money side, I am not doing the best, I might still have other advantages that make the money issue more negligent when compared to that. And then what you want is you want to do the more complicated weighing of money versus, let's say, the ability to communicate. So maybe outsourcing the work would be less costly, but the ability to communicate within the team without frictions and ultimately to achieve good results is being compromised much more. So yes, we are going to pay local employees more than we would have paid someone outsourced, but we are gaining better results and ultimately we rely on our results in order to achieve our goals. So then this is a weighing that is not money versus money, but we can still determine that we gain something more important at the cost of losing something that is comparatively worse. So then it's just a question of what are we comparing to what, and we want to be the ones showing the comparative and constantly hammering that to the decision makers. So it's okay to acknowledge that there are flaws. The question should be, if we want to make a good decision, how do we weigh between the things? And of course, if we believe in our idea, we would want to show that the weighing goes in our favor. Okay, so here, just to sum up the idea, so we have 3 types of non-comparative attacks, and as we can see, 2 of them don't really challenge whether our proposal is good or not. So the demand for perfection doesn't say that what we do is bad. Actually, it implicitly accepts that it's good, because then the only critique is it's not good enough. There could have been more of that good thing, and you can even use this to your advantage. You can even say explicitly to the person that has this attack on you, so I see we agree that we are able to help these and these populations. then we are only left to discuss this population that you're concerned about, and then you answer. People who state the obvious don't directly challenge whether your proposal is good or not. Often they would just say something that is a fact, and a fact is devoid of normative value. So a fact can't be good or bad in it of itself. It's a matter of interpretation, but oftentimes it doesn't even say that your idea is bad. It just states something about it. If you are worried that someone might understand it as such, then you can address that, but oftentimes it doesn't even challenge that. But a critique in a vacuum does find something that is bad with your proposition, and then you have to address that fact. Then, what does it look like? So if we have to paraphrase it, a demand for perfection is the idea is good, but not enough, or not all cases are covered by the idea. Stating the obvious is the idea comes with costs. And critique in a vacuum is there are disadvantages to the idea. So all can be true, and then the question is, how do we create the comparison that is lacking in all of these statements? So then what we want to do in demand for perfection, we show that the edge cases are not deal breakers. In stating the obvious, we agree, and then we just show that it is not bad, might even be good. And if we have a valid critique, we just weigh it when we compare to the other alternatives, doing nothing or doing something else. So, after all of this explaining on my part, a small drill. So, I chose three topics for debate, so debates that are relevant to our lives, and I have different attacks on those ideas, and I would want us to try and identify what kind of attack this is, and then think about what could we do to answer them. And please take this literally, so don't assume there is anything else that is being said just for the sake of the drill, and oftentimes because people sometimes do give you just this sentence and then you have to run with it, so you don't always have to assume that there is much more behind this. So let's say that we are having a debate about banning TikTok, and we are for banning it. And then someone says to us, well, users might still be able to access it using VPN.
It's of Clash? It's of Clash.
So it's not exactly off Clash because it is true. And so, yes, and also it's an edge case, right? So here, I think what we can identify is that, yes, some users would be able to access it using VPN. However, if we compare it to the other scenario, we would have much less users accessing it. If you have to use a VPN and you need to go through all this trouble, obviously we would have less people using it if we compare it to a situation in which it's just legal. So in that sense, we might still create a very good effect. We would have much less people using TikTok. They won't be exposed to all the harms of it. Would some people bypass it in an illegal way? Yes, they would. But all in all, still good job on our behalf, right? So we impacted millions of people, and yes, we might have some people bypassing this. Still a win on our side, even though it might happen. Then, let's say someone says, this doesn't affect Meta. Yes, truism, indeed. We are targeting this specifically against TikTok and not against all social media. And we're doing it for reasons. So let's say we are targeting TikTok because it is owned by the Chinese government, and then we're concerned about that, and Meta is still in the US, so we think that there is a difference there. So yes, we are not targeting Meta for a good reason. Or we might think that TikTok has harms that are unique to it that don't exist in other social media platforms, and then ultimately, it boils down to this is a deliberate choice, and it is very true that we are not targeting Meta, and it is not a bug, it's a feature.
But isn't it also irrelevant? Because we're
talking about TikTok and all of a sudden they're...
So it's also irrelevant, but here I think in this case, this person is trying to show that we are hypocrites, which is a very bad argument. Usually, arguments of hypocrisy are not good arguments because at best they show that maybe there are reasons not to trust us personally, but it doesn't mean that the thing itself shouldn't be done. So we might have different or preferential treatment to X versus Y, but we should still treat X the same way and not change the way we do. So in that sense, I think you are correct, but also I would say that we have reasons not to target Meta, because I think it is important for stating our case. So it would help us to show the unique reasons why we are targeting TikTok, because we have this very specific policy. So we're not saying social media is bad, although it might be. We're saying TikTok is particularly pernicious, therefore we are targeting it. Okay. Then, third argument, someone says, this denies people of a fun pastime. It's their choice. Okay, this is a tricky one, because I think it's a pretty decent argument to make. I think it's a valid criticism. If we ban TikTok, we are banning people from doing something they enjoy, and oftentimes we don't limit people's choices, even if we disagree with them. Exactly. So, because it is a valid criticism, but if we believe that we should ban TikTok, we don't think this is a good enough reason to stop us from doing that. What we want to do is we want to explain why we are okay with limiting people's choice in this case of TikTok. So yes, we are taking something fun from them, but we think that the danger of having a foreign government intervening in the type of content that millions of people watch every day is a reason enough to take away something that is indeed fun for people. And then we weigh the two things. So yes, of course, this is something we have to deal with, right? This is a very solid argument against, but it's not a winning one. Then, fourth thing is users will find other platforms to be addicted to. They might. But here, I think this is something that we are taking into consideration. Users might be addicted to other social media, but comparatively, we think that it is better if they spend more time on Instagram rather than they spend the same time on TikTok. And then we can agree with that, but we don't think that ultimately this is a bad thing. This is something that's actually good. Then let's say, let's do this example, just because I want to make sure that we have time for everything. Let's go for one more example. So let's say we are debating whether to automate a factory or not. And someone says there will be less employees in the factory. That's true. Yes, that is kind of the point of automation, to have less labor, to cut costs on that, to make ourselves efficient by that. So it's not out of being mean, it's just that this is what automation means. We would need less people to do a job that can be done by a machine. So in this sense, yes, this is what this means. This in itself is not a good or bad thing, that there would be less people in the factory. We're going to see another claim that is being made that is much better than this, but this type of phrasing is just kind of true. Then, let's say someone says robotic arms still can't replace a human grip. By the way, true, a problem that Amazon is dealing with. So, what do we do with this? It's an edge case, exactly. So this means that we will not use automation for tasks that require a human grip. However, we can use automation for other tasks in our factory. So in this sense, this is not a case against. It just shows that we are going to use it in very specific ways in which it can have an effect, in which it can do what it is that we want it to do. So in that sense, it doesn't replace everything, but it can replace a lot. Then third type of attack is many workers will become chronically unemployed. We bear a responsibility to them. Here, it's a strong argument. It's something that we have to deal with, right? Ultimately, I think it is likely. People are going to lose their jobs. Some of them are not going to find another job. We have to face it. I think it would be a mistake to bury our head in the sand and say, no, it'll be fine. And here, if we are for automation, we will have to show why we think that this is a sacrifice we're willing to make. Why, ultimately, the kind of benefits that we gain through automation, the ability to, let's say, lower the price for the end customer, the ability to compete in the international market versus other factories, and then not have to maybe fire the employees anyway because we couldn't keep up. So there are things to be said, and we really need to think about what is true or what we believe in, but we can't brush it off. We have to really weigh this in comparison to whatever benefits we think this actually gives us that are good enough reason for us to continue this policy. So yeah, so this is a more tricky one, but one that we should be able to face if we want to prove. So yeah. Then third type of attack is the nuclear option. Now, what does this mean? This refers to a situation in which someone finds some sort of outcome that is a possibility. It's something that can happen, but it's not a probability. So it's not very likely to happen. And this outcome is a nightmare. So someone finds a scenario in which if we do this proposal, something horrendous will happen. Now, the thing is that I consider this to be an attack, not in the cases where maybe we should be wary of dangers, or if we are in a situation where we actually try to be risk avoidant, which might be the case, but sometimes we are not that risk avoidant and someone might still find the worst outcome that can happen and then they just say it. Oh, but maybe something terrible will happen. Maybe if we teach that in schools and then the government turns fascists, something terrible will happen. Yes, but it's a very unlikely scenario to happen, or I hope. And then the thing is that this is effective in actually damaging our idea because people are risk averse and people don't like change. And then if someone presents them with an option that is easy to imagine and is very, very bad, they would start fearing and they might even drop the idea as a whole. But of course, this doesn't mean that we think the idea should be dropped, right? This might be a possibility, but we don't think that this goes against the idea as a whole, and we need to be mindful of that. So let's say, by the way, we already do that today. So someone might say, oh, if we have a very violent video game, someone might use them as simulation and go out and buy a gun and shoot other people. And this has happened, but we don't ban video games, right? Because we think that even though it is a case that can happen, it is so rare. It is so hard to show a causal link that even though there might be some correlation, this is not something that we take into consideration. So already today, we're not always going with the riskiest option that there is, and we should be mindful of that. So then, how do we respond to this? So first of all, there is no need to deny the gravity of the nightmarish scenario. So we don't have to say that something bad is bad, is not bad. But what we do want to do is that we want, instead of talking about whether it is good or bad, we just want to show that it is rare. So we want to show that it is not very probable, and we want to give the rationale behind that. So then it's not a question of should we be afraid if it happens, but should we worry that it would happen? And here the answer is no, we shouldn't. And then we want to weigh it against the more likely benefits. So on the one hand, we want to show that nightmare scenario is very rare or even external to what we do, so it's not caused by whatever we are proposing. And on the other hand, we want to show that if we go with a proposal, we can, for a certainty, get these and these and these benefits. So then it becomes not a matter of do we just avoid the risk, but do we deny ourselves the potential benefits from what we are offering just because we want to avoid a very rare risk? So then the decision makers understand that the question is not just do we avoid this, but do we also avoid everything good that might come with the proposal that we have, and is it worth it for this? And also we can always use precedents that we have. So constantly we make decisions that are a trade-off between danger and benefit. So even the fact that we can drive a car on the road. So ultimately we can, God forbid, be in a car accident, and yet we find that freedom of movement is much more important than the risk that might happen from any accident. Therefore, we allow it. So it's not as if always danger trumps everything, and the moment we are aware of this, we just need to show what is the balance of probabilities, and that it is in our favor. And what we can do is we can address the case of if this big bad does happen. So we can show that either there are other solutions, or there is something to be done about that or in that situation, or sometimes if it happens there are much bigger problems to solve. So let's say that we have an app and someone is worried that if we use Google servers, maybe one day Google would not function. I think if Google would not function, our small app might take a hit, but I think everyone else would take such a bigger hit that it doesn't really matter. So in that sense. Okay, then fourth category of attacks are logical fallacies. Now this is a huge topic and we will not get into all logical fallacies, but the concept is that a logical fallacy is an argument that sounds persuasive, it sounds true, but there is something faulty with the logic in such a way that we cannot really create a connection between the claim and the conclusion from that claim. And these are often used either in a way that is just mistaken, so people don't understand logics and then they reach conclusions that they shouldn't, or sometimes they are being used in a manipulative way. So sometimes people use it in order to confuse, in order to actually prove something that they shouldn't. And here I think it's a fascinating topic that I would encourage you to also learn about generally, but we're going to focus on three that I think are the most common, at least in workspaces. So we're going to talk about anecdotal evidence, we're going to talk about argumentum ad antiquitatem, and pulling rank or appeal to authority. So starting with the first one, anecdotal evidence. So this refers to a situation in which someone uses just a story to try and convince us of some sort of conclusion that is supposedly relevant to our case, but they only use the story as evidence. So here I think the starkest example of this would be someone saying, oh, you know, my grandmother is 100 years old and she smokes a pack of cigarettes a day, so cigarettes can't be bad for you. Now, the problem is that this is a story. It's one case. It's not a study case. It doesn't apply to any general pattern. It doesn't say anything big. Actually, reality acts in a very different way, but we can always find a story to show that something is true, even though it's not. And the problem is not the use of story as a part of a good argument. This is something that I would actually recommend that you do. So let's say you have a good argument and you have the logic for it and the explanation, and then you use a story or example to show more why it is true. Then this is a good use of stories, and stories are highly effective. The problem is that people use one story out of context in order to jump into a conclusion that is not true and is not backed by any logic. And then it becomes a problem. And this happens a lot. So we might have a certain proposal and someone says, we tried to do something similar back in the past and it failed. Okay, this doesn't mean anything about this proposal. It doesn't mean that this proposal will fail. It doesn't even mean that the cases are similar. It's just that someone just throws it there. And because people like stories so much, because stories are indeed persuasive, they might get the wrong impression. They might now be persuaded, oh yeah, maybe it's a good idea. Yeah, I remember that time. And then they wouldn't give our idea a chance. And I think that's the main problem of using that people can be fooled by this to think something that is much grander than that. So here I think it's important to know this, but then on the question of how we deal with this. So I also brought videos here, but I kind of gave you the cigarettes example, but it's also shown very nicely in Mad Men. And also I brought you another one of a girl saying to a guy that she thinks it's a bad idea to date him because her friend had a similar case, and he's basically saying that the friend is the exception to the rule. But the friend was not necessarily evidence that they could not hit it off if they date each other. So, no? Okay. So, how do you respond? So first, just like with other cases, no point into going to the story, right? So you don't have to prove that, oh, this didn't fail in the past, or your grandmother, she's not, like, no point into getting into that. What you want is you can acknowledge the facts of the story, but you want to sever the tie between that and between the conclusion from the story, or the conclusion that that person is trying to get out of that story. So what you want to show is ultimately that either the two cases are different. So maybe that former idea failed in the past because it didn't have the resources and the managerial support. But this time we have them, therefore we are likely to succeed. So then we want to show that circumstances have changed in such a way that the outcome would not be the same as it was in that story or in that example. And then that's what we want to highlight. So we want to really understand what happened here, what doesn't happen there, and then prove that and ultimately go to the result. The other option is that we show that the story is an exception to the rule. And then we talk about probabilities once again. So it might have been that that story fell within the rare cases in which something went bad. However, the general probable trend is this and this and this. We give other counter evidence, and then we show why in our case it is very likely that the result would be the one that has happened in all of the other stories that we have, in all the other evidence that we have gathered. So then it becomes okay, this is more likely to happen, and then we can make a decision. So that's on that. Then another type of logical fallacy is appealing to the fact that things were always like this. So going back to antiquity, saying, oh, but in our company we always did this. This is the way. But the issue is that the fact that something happened in the past or that we do it now doesn't mean it's good. It can also be bad. And I'm sure, and here I would ask you, because I'm sure it's on the top of your head, to think about something that persisted for a very, very long time, and yet we wouldn't say that it should have continued, even though historically it was very long.
Cutting hands of teeth?
Yeah, so that persisted. I'd also say slavery. So this was one of the arguments for that this is just the way of the world. It has always been like that, even though it wasn't. But yeah, it doesn't mean that we would want to continue that just because it existed for such a long time. So in that case, it is a fallacy. Now, once again, this can be used in a way that is not a fallacy. One can say that the type of solution that we currently have is good enough because of reasons. There is no need to take a risk on something because we like what we have. That is a good argument. But simply saying that it is good because it exists or it is good because it is old doesn't make it good. By the way, vice versa as well. So someone might say, and we hear that in the tech world a lot, that because something is new, it's good. Oh, this is the way forward. This is progress. This is development. The fact that it's new doesn't mean that it's good. Maybe we should stick to the old ways. So in that sense, just the, let's say, the novelty of something doesn't mean that it's good or bad, and this is a form of fallacy. So then what we want to do is we want to show people that even though we don't like changes, and it is a problem with the human psychology, that there should be reasons to change, and that there are problems with whatever they are defending at the moment, and there are benefits that are comparatively better in what we are suggesting. And then this is what we are aiming for. Now, I brought here another video, but we won't get to it. But if you want, it's just a funny watch. So there's an entire series of these. If you like Star Trek, there is Star Trek Logical Thinking, in which Spock just highlights a logical fallacy and explains to the humans who are so irrational what they should have done better. So in this case, he does that as well. And of course, he's right because he's Spock. But this is also a logical fallacy on my behalf, which is the next one, which is pulling rank. So here what I did, I just said, oh, this is right because he's Spock. It doesn't mean it's right. So the fact that I use him as a source of authority is in itself also a logical fallacy. So I might want to use authority to improve my argument. But if I only appeal to authority, if I only use someone else who has some sort of ethos, or if I just use my rank and I say, oh, I've been doing it for 20 years, oh, I have coached world champions, it doesn't mean that I'm right or wrong. And this oftentimes happens in the workplace as well, or sometimes even in a family setting. Parents really like doing that, in which someone might just think that they are right because they have more authority than you do, but then this is problematic. This prevents us from actually talking about the merit of things. And then what this means is that even though it might be very tempting to kind of defend our honor and to show that, okay, we might be new here, we might not have the experience, or yes, maybe someone that you respect does this, it doesn't mean that it's right. I wouldn't go into a defensive mode. I would try to pivot the discussion to the idea itself. So here, I think it's fair to say that with all due respect to our competitors, they are doing this and it doesn't help them, as you can see, and this and this and this. Or I respect your professional expertise and I think it's very valid. In this case, I think that maybe we've overlooked something, and then we always try to pull the discussion back to the idea itself and not to the authority here. And here, this is what you should do. I would say that there are certain situations in which might not necessarily help, and then it wouldn't hurt to also pull in some sort of source of authority to counter it if you think that people are very, very sensitive to it to the point where they don't actually listen to the idea, and then find your own source of authority that the decision maker actually respects, and then you can at least show that there are, let's say, rated opinions that think the other way, and also it helps to build a coalition. So if you can show that more people are on your side, always helps. Not ideal. In a perfect world, we would talk about only the ideas and weigh them, but if not, do what you can. At least know that it's a type of fallacy, and then don't be alarmed by it. And fifth type of attack, nitpicking. So this refers to a situation in which someone finds a fault in what we said and then uses that to completely discredit us. So this can look like, oh, but one of your 5 examples was wrong. And then they would try to show that everything you said is wrong. Or, no, that organizational change happened in that year. And then they go from there to show that nothing that you say can be trusted. And this is, of course, a fallacy because, to err is human. Sometimes we do that. It happens. Is it the best? No. But it can be that we made a mistake. But the fact that we made a certain mistake in our pitch doesn't mean that the idea is bad and doesn't mean that we lied in everything that we said. So then what we want to do is we want to find a way to ultimately rebuild the case and make it not about this mistake, but to get the discussion back on track into evaluating the idea that we have. I brought another video that we would not get into, but the concept is really funny. It's this guy who does a YouTube channel called CinemaSins, in which he just takes down films and says that they are very bad because he finds inaccuracies in them. So here you can see that in K-pop Demon Hunters, for example, he found that they say that the concert of the Saja Boys is at noon, but the ticket says 11. So yes, so very, very bad. And you don't want people to treat you like that. So you might have mistakes, but still you might have a good point or a good movie. So then, how do you respond? So you don't have to defend the mistake, and you don't have to be very apologetic about it. So you don't want to be seen as if you are now trying to recover. And I think it's very okay to admit the fact that it was a mistake, but the important thing is to bring the discussion back. And a phrase that can really help you is even if. So here you don't even have to say that this was a mistake, You can say, even if this example is wrong, still we have 4 other examples that prove that this is likely to happen. Or even if the circumstances are not exactly as described, this is still logical because of reasons. So even if is a very good word for you to use because already it frames what you say in a kind of way that helps you bring the discussion back. So mistake, even if, then you go on to say what you actually want to say, which could either be a defense of the explanation or the rationale. So even though let's say the experiment that we referred to was proven to be faulty in some way, the rationale behind the conclusion of the experiment still holds because people still do this and this and this. Or let's say we had an experiment that was only done on American college students, it can still be relevant to our target audience because they are similar enough, and then we can show that, yes, it's not like the best example, but still the rationale holds in our case. And that's what we want to prove. Second option is that the conclusion is still, and this is a term used by McKinsey actually, so if someone works in McKinsey or knows people, they love using directionally correct, because then they don't have to commit to certain facts, they can just say that directionally this is correct. So you can use that as well in your persuasion. So then you want to say that ultimately the conclusion can still stand. So it can still be true despite certain things not being very accurate. So yeah, so this is something you can aim for. Then, sixth type of attack, and this is a bonus one. So it didn't exist in the original talk that I had, but it is new, it is relevant, and it is super interesting. So maybe you've already encountered it. This refers to people who would go on ChatGPT or Claude, and they would start asking a question, and then they would give you the answer that the chat gave, and this would be their proof, and this would be, okay, and that's why we should go with my idea and not your idea, because the chat said so. And because some people do consider the chat to be our new overlord, so they might fall into that. They might think, oh yeah, if Claude said that, it must be a good idea. Thing is, it might not be a good idea. It's also a type of attack that is not fully rational. And the reason, because that, if we're thinking more critically, is that when we look at AIs, then first of all, they suffer from what is called, it's a Greek word, sycophancy, which means that they tend to suck up to us. So they appease us. They talk to us in a way that we would want to hear. And that's why oftentimes we might write something in the chat and we would get an answer, and then we would say, oh no, but this doesn't make sense because this and this and this. And then we would get, this is a very good pushback. Or, this now puts this in a new context. Or, you are right to insist. And we don't know whether it is because we are right or because the algorithm works in such a way that it tells us that we are right. But this means that we might have someone that talks to the chat, and because the chat feels that this person is for a certain idea, or maybe this person is actually for a certain idea and he just has it as a part of the input, then the chat gives the output that that person wants to hear. So then it's not proof that this is a good idea. It's just proof that the chat really understood what this person wanted the result to be, and then it just gave it to them. But then might not be true. The second issue with AI is that the context is oftentimes selective or even distorted. So it might have context from other chats that this person had, and then it has a wrong reading of the situation, or maybe the person, when they started chatting, didn't give the entire context. So maybe they didn't reflect that our bosses care much more about certain considerations and care less about other considerations, and then the context was missing. Or sometimes there's even the issue of the chat not referring to its history because it doesn't have that big of a memory. So maybe that person gave a certain reason in the beginning of the chat, but at the stage where the chat gives the final answer, it doesn't remember what was already said before, and then it just didn't take it into consideration. So in that sense, if it was a human making the decision, it would have had all the context, but the chat doesn't have it, and then the result is as follows. Third thing is that the chat is value neutral, but people are not. So people might have considerations or prioritizations that are based on values, and that's okay, but the chat doesn't have it. And then it doesn't really reflect the way that our company works. So maybe our company wants to give certain jobs to people who suffer from disabilities, and they do it not because of how much money they would get, but because they see it as a value. And the chat might not know that this is a value that we in our company care about. Other companies might not care about it, but this is something that we do. So then if it were to give us advice, it might not have the same type of thinking that is value-led like we would have had if we were to converse about this. And then, lastly, sometimes it just hallucinates. So sometimes it just makes things up, or it doesn't know the fact, it's not updated, and then it would make a decision based on facts that are just made up. So then, not a good source for decision making, or at least not uncritically. So if someone just copy pastes and says, Grok said that, no, don't believe them. So what do you want to do? But before that, I brought a short video just to show you, if we were to translate AI into a metaphor that we do know, why it is a manipulation.
Well, I have another opinion poll done showing the voters are against bringing back national service.
They can't be for it,
Of course they can, Bernard. A nice young lady comes up to you. Obviously you want to create a good impression, so she starts asking you some questions. Are you worried about the rise in crime among teenagers?
Yes.
Do you think there's a lack of discipline in our comprehensive schools?
Yes.
Do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives?
Yes.
Do you think they respond to a challenge?
Yes.
Would you be in favour of reintroducing national service?
Well, I suppose I might.
Yes or no?
Yes.
So, they don't mention the first 5 questions, they publish the last one.
Is that really what they do?
Well, not the reputable ones, no, but there aren't many of those. So, alternatively, the young lady can get the opposite result. Are you worried about the danger of war? Are you worried about the growth of arms? Do you think there's a danger in giving young people guns and teaching them how to kill?
Yes.
Do you think it's wrong to force people to take up arms against their will?
Yes.
Would you oppose the reintroduction of national service?
Yes.
The perfect balanced sum.
So I think many people use the chat in the same way. They would have very directed questions, they would already make their point in an implicit way, and then they would just show you the last question, and they can do the same thing with the opposite opinion. So in that sense, it is a form of manipulation, but because it's technological, sometimes people can hide it better. So what do we do? So what we aim to do is we want to go back to basics. So ideally, we want to bring this into a conversation and not just be left with, okay, this is you against Claude. But we want it to be, okay, these are people discussing. And in order to do that, then we want to say, wait, let's take a step back. Let's analyze this. Let's go over the reasoning. I want to understand what's behind this. And then we try to get an actual conversation going on and not just blindly follow that. And I think if possible, you can also turn to someone's ego as well. It's like, yeah, I'm sure you can make the right decision. I trust you more than I would trust the AI, and so on. And then to bring this back to a sphere which we can actually logically discuss things, then I would consider whether I want to dispute facts. There would be instances in which the chat made a wrong decision because it had really wrong facts. And then maybe I would decide to dispute that, maybe not. I think there are certain cases in which I would not go into that because it would turn into my word versus the chat, if it's not that obvious. If it's obvious, yes, you can highlight it. But if not, it becomes at best you showing that the AI can't be fully trusted, but it doesn't take away from that person's conviction that the conclusion that the AI reached is true. So then I would advise to talk about the reason behind and to go back to actually weighing the pros and cons in a comparative way and not necessarily to delve into arguing the facts, because it might have limited success, if any. And if you're desperate, you can always generate the opposite response, but once again, it would just show that we need to talk about this and that the AI is not good enough. So what it will do, it will just disarm this as a tool. Maybe it will come down to this. I think it's really a question of how much people believe in the tech. Ideally, you can avoid this, but if not, well, at least it proves the point. So then it could get you back to the discussion. So that's that. Then I see that we're very short on time. I brought another short thing, but it's really a part of what we said. If you get questions in the Q&A, it's really important, just like we talked about, to try and understand the actual stance of the person in front of us. So this means that you get some sort of question in the Q&A. You want to try and figure out whether this person commenting doesn't agree at all. So they said this in order to try and say, you are wrong. We should do something else. And then if you understand this, you need to understand, okay, what is the clash? What are we disagreeing about? And then go from there to show that you are right. But this is one option. Sometimes someone would have a comment or question that indicate that they only partially agree. This is important to discern because sometimes there might be a person who can be on our side, but they have certain concerns. They're not even saying that we shouldn't go with the idea. They just want to discuss a certain aspect of it. And if we are able to understand that, we are able to, first of all, explicitly say, so I see that we agree on this and this and this. And this is already good because it allows everyone else listening to understand that this is not now something that would sabotage the idea, but this is just an invitation for a more in-depth conversation, but it means that we don't give out the wrong impression about the question. So then it's important to understand from this person, and I would even ask, or I would ask a question to that person to try and assess whether it's a matter of them completely rejecting or they're on our side, we can cooperate with them, and we just need to understand where to take this conversation from that point. Sometimes there are cases where a person actually agrees with us and they just have a comment or question that are quite confusing. It might even be a cultural thing that some people would start their comment with no and then they would say something in favor. And it happens. Or sometimes people have a question or comment because they want to hear themselves speak or they want to get validation for what they think. And in that case, if we understand that they actually agree, this is fantastic because then we can just use that as an opportunity to reinforce what we wanted to say. And then we shouldn't be alarmed by this question or comment. It's, oh, great, yeah, I see we're both on the same page. Yeah, I see you agree. Yeah, this story actually reinforces exactly what I've shown in the past. And then you just treat it with a smile and you go on to use this as further evidence that you are correct. So even though it might sound in tone bad or it might be a question, doesn't always mean that it's actually a question or a critique or something like that. And sometimes it's just off clash and then you know what to do. You steer back the argument to where it should be. So what have we learned so far? First of all, don't panic. It's really important. People have a lot to say, and it doesn't mean that we can't win. And what we want doesn't mean our idea is bad. Even if people might seem hostile, words can help us. So it's really important that if we are at the point where we are receiving comments, questions, that we listen very carefully. We take a deep breath. You don't have to be impulsive. You don't have to give the first answer that comes to your head. I would even write down the question or comment if it helps you. And then what you want to do is you actually want to identify the type of attack or what's happening there, or if it is an attack even, then you want to find, well, so what's the fault here? What's happening? Is this a fallacy? Is this off clash? Like, is this something that is actually good? Like, really think about this in a comparative way, in a way that sees this in light of your conviction that you are right, and then you just pick the most appropriate answer and you give it. The important thing is not to be dragged into what your opponent wants. So maybe they want to talk about their own thing, don't let them. You are in charge, it's your idea, you need to defend it, you can make sure that the conversation is being held at least in right terms. So ultimately, we don't know what decision makers will decide, but at least you want to give yourself a fair chance of the ideas being logically considered based on their merit, and I think that's the best that we can aim. And the last thing is you want to separate the intention from the content, and this refers to sometimes there are people who really have bad faith and they don't want to discuss. And if you recognize that they are not willing to actually engage, actually listen to an answer, then maybe it's not worth engaging with them at all. Then maybe this is the point where you say, no, I'm not having this conversation, or you know that you are actually trying to persuade someone else, and then you go back to what you say, you don't engage with this person, but you go back to claiming what it is that you claim. So, having said all of that, thank you very much. Best of luck, and you've been a great audience.